This material offers a really detailed geopolitical and economic analysis of the sustained multi-province protests in Iran, focusing on domestic triggers, the regime's crackdown, and that heightened U.S. pressure.
And the foundation is rock solid. I mean, there's a remarkable grasp of the current instability, establishing that reality of twin pressures, internal economic collapse and external threats.
Right.
But if we're going to maximize the impact here, especially where it gets into the future, we have to stop treating some of these crucial data points like they're just footnotes.
I agree. It identifies two major plausible future paths, right? Short-term repression versus a more prolonged national escalation.
Exactly. And while the material effectively outlines those two scenarios, the analysis would be significantly strengthened by integrating the crucial regional concentration of the conflict directly into those forecasts.
Okay, so what's the specific weakness there?
Well, the section correctly identifies that the concentration of deaths and, confrontations is strongest in the western provinces, Kermanshah, Loristan, Hamadan.
It calls them historically abandoned, which is powerful.
It's very powerful, and the cradle of anti-regime movements. The weakness is that this really specific, potent detail is, it's currently presented as a standalone fact.
Just a piece of good context.
A piece of excellent context, but it isn't leveraged to differentiate or refine those two big national scenarios at the end.
Then the outcome of that fight has to dictate the probability of the national scenarios.
Okay, so the suggestion.
We need to use the regional dynamics of those Western provinces to introduce maybe a third, more nuanced scenario, or at the very least add a vital conditionality to the existing two. We can't just rely on national economic stats when the front line is so clearly defined.
Let's make that actionable. How do we turn that regional pressure cooker into a real forecasting tool? Okay, so we link the success of the regime's strategy directly to its ability to contain that geography. For instance, in that scenario of short-term repression,
Right.
we should explicitly state that success depends entirely on isolating those regional hotspots, on preventing their contagion to Tehran or other major central cities. I mean, the regime wins the short-term game only if the western provinces feel far away.
And for the prolonged crisis scenario, how does that change?
There we develop an explicit conditionality. We could say something like, if the repression in Kermanshah and Loristan fails to neutralize the dissent within that initial 10-day window you mentioned,
Yeah.
that failure significantly increases the probability of the prolonged crisis scenario, no matter what external actors like Trump are saying or doing.
In those specific hard-hit provinces.
You risk creating vacuums or, operational limits somewhere else, maybe in places with key infrastructure.
Precisely. You could consider adding a line just discussing whether that need to divert resources to contain the periphery risks creating instability back in the core. That turns the regional analysis into a systematic vulnerability assessment.
And that's a much more powerful layer of depth.
It is. Okay, I think that shift from a static fact to a dynamic condition for the scenarios is critical. Now, sticking with that theme of resource allocation, let's pivot to the economic paradox, which is really the engine driving all this domestic anger.
Right, so the material makes a compelling case that the economic collapse was triggered by the regime prioritizing vast external spending.
On missiles, the nuclear program, proxies in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon.
Yemen, Gaza, the West Bank, the list goes on. But it could benefit from analyzing the dual nature of this spending as both a cause of collapse and a tool for regime survival.
So the spending is clearly the direct cause of the anger, the reason all that remains are crumbs, as the notes say. Where's the weakness in just presenting it that way?
The current analysis frames this external spending solely as an economic liability, as a source of domestic anger, and that overlooks a critical geopolitical dimension that, it fundamentally shapes the regime's decision-making.
Which is what, exactly?
Which is that these expensive external structures, the proxies, the military capacity, they are often the very mechanisms the regime relies on to project strength, to divide elites at home, and to deter foreign intervention.
So they're economically crippling, but they're essential for its internal survival.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The security apparatus that is financially ruining the nation is also, from the regime's perspective, the non-negotiable insurance policy against regime change.
Exactly.
So we need to explore this paradoxical element. how the expensive security apparatus that ruined the economy is now, paradoxically, key to the regime's current resilience.
So the reader should be wrestling with this question.
Yes. Does dismantling these external structures, which is what foreign interests always want, does that actually weaken the regime internally? Or is maintaining them, even at the cost of economic ruin, a non-negotiable strategy when you're in survival mode?
That completely reframes the economic discussion. It's not an accounting problem anymore. It becomes a strategic defense problem.
It does.
So how do we weave that complexity in?
Well, we can introduce a point that the regime, when it's operating in survival mode, prioritizes control and security over prosperity. It just does. And from that point of view, its foreign proxy network represents a crucial, physical layer of this security, its defense in depth.
So the economic ruin is the price they're willing to pay for regime security. We should ask that question explicitly then. Is the internal pressure mitigated or is it exacerbated by the very external actions that require all this money?
Precisely. Because if the regime can successfully sell this narrative of economic warfare, arguing that the spending is necessary because of these external threats the proxies are fighting, then that spending becomes a narrative tool.
It justifies the domestic pain.
Okay, so the concrete suggestion here is to specifically link the regime's diplomatic and military assets maintained by this spending to its ability to withstand, say, Trump's threats of foreign attack.
Exactly. By doing that, you elevate the analysis. You demonstrate the clear survival rationale for the economic priority. You move past just simple economic loss to a deep strategic calculus. It gives the reader a much deeper understanding of why the spending continues, even when the country is on fire.
It's an unsustainable strategy, sure, but it's a necessary one for short-term control.
That's a huge enhancement to the strategic angle. Now let's pivot to the third piece of this, which is the struggle for control over information itself. I love the conceptual framing here.
I do too. The discussion of the digital blackout and this idea that information becomes terrain that has to be occupied and dominated. I mean, that's a sophisticated and compelling metaphor.
It is.
But the critique should push it further by applying that same concept to the protesters' ability to evolve their coordination.
Right, because the current weakness is this asymmetry. The analysis correctly identifies the blackout's effect on the regime's control, hindering journalism, verification of abuses, all of that. It's framed as an effective state censorship tool.
But in doing so, it sort of implicitly assumes that state action alone determines the outcome of this information war.
And it doesn't really discuss the resilience or the adaptability of the protest coordination itself.
Not substantially. I mean, if the blackout truly cut off all effective coordination, the protests shouldn't have been sustained for over 10 days and across more than 350 localities. That doesn't add up.
The fact that the protests continued is the evidence. It's the proof that the state's dominance of that informational terrain isn't absolute.
Exactly. So we need to challenge the assumption that the digital blackout is decisive. Given the sustained nature of the instability, the material should incorporate a brief reflection on how the protesters have adapted their operational security and coordination after the initial blackout.
Using alternative, maybe low-tech means of communication that just bypass that standard infrastructure?
Yes, and that moves the analysis from just a story about state censorship to a story about decentralized resistance.
So how do we apply that terrain metaphor creatively?
Well, if the digital space, the high ground, let's say, is successfully dominated by the state, where does the protest movement establish new, uncontestable informational territory?
That's a powerful way to think about it. And that new territory could be analog, right?
It has to be. If the blackout dismantles digital coordination, then we should suggest exploring what methods of analog or decentralized communication might sustain a movement that's already spread across all 31 provinces.
We're not just talking about cell phones anymore.
No, we're talking about localized physical networks, visual symbols, prearranged signals, maybe even just oral networks that operate completely outside of the bandwidth the state controls.
And we can link this back to something you mentioned in the notes about the regime's operational philosophy.
We absolutely should. Propose focusing a sentence or two on whether the regime's reliance on control above efficiency, as it says in the closing thoughts, makes their digital control predictable.
Or vulnerable.
Or vulnerable to low-tech, decentralized countermeasures from the street. If the whole system is only designed for brute force control, it might completely miss the subtle shifts happening in analog resistance.
That adds a fantastic layer. It shows that the regime's own internal philosophy might be its Achilles heel in the information war.
It's a much more holistic view.
It is. This has been an incredibly robust analysis of what is already very complex material.
Look, the foundational analysis you submitted is exceptionally strong. There's a powerful grasp of the economic drivers and, those crucial specific details about the conflict in the Western provinces.
The structure is there, the detail is there, but now we've added these dynamic linkages.
So, to really maximize the piece's analytical impact, here's a quick summary of the 3 main recommendations.
Let's hear them.
First, you have to fully integrate that specific regional dynamic of the Western provinces, Kermanshah, Loristan, Hamadan, to explicitly refine or condition the 2 major future scenarios.
Make it a trigger, not just a fact.
Second, sharpen the argument on the military and proxy spending by explicitly exploring its paradoxical role as an essential tool for internal regime survival, not just an economic liability.
The strategic calculus behind the spending.
Exactly. And finally, extend that powerful information is terrain metaphor to analyze the adaptability and resilience of the protesters' coordination efforts beyond the initial digital blackout.
These are specific, clear, and very actionable steps. I think they'll strengthen the logic and the robustness of the entire piece.
I think so too.
Apply these suggestions, send it back our way, and we'll be ready for round 2. We look forward to seeing the revised analysis.